What happens to a man who has been trained to kill from impossible distances, who has learned to become invisible in any terrain, who has taken more lives than he can remember, when the war finally ends and he is told to go home and be normal? What happens when the skills that made him invaluable on the battlefield make him dangerous in peacetime? What happens when the government that once called him a hero now sees him as a threat? Before I tell you the shocking truth about what happened to the Apache snipers after World War II, a truth that was buried for over 60 years, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from right now. Then hit that subscribe button, because this channel desperately needs your support to keep uncovering these hidden stories that powerful people never wanted you to hear. Now let me tell you about the warriors who came home to find that their war had only just begun. September 1945. The Japanese Empire had surrendered. The deadliest conflict in human history was finally over. Across the United States, soldiers were returning to parades and celebrations, to families who had waited years to embrace them again, to a nation eager to forget the horrors of war and embrace the promise of peace. For most veterans, the transition was difficult but manageable. They had nightmares. They struggled to adjust, but eventually most of them found their way back to normal life. But there was a group of soldiers for whom normal life was never an option, a group whose skills were so specialized, whose training was so intense, whose experiences were so far outside the boundaries of ordinary human existence that they could never truly come home. These were the Apache snipers, the most lethal marksmen the United States military had ever produced. And what happened to them after the war reveals one of the darkest chapters in the history of American veterans. The Apache sniper program had been created in 1942, in the desperate early months of the war when it seemed like the Axis powers might actually win. Military planners, searching for any advantage that might turn the tide, remembered the fierce resistance that Apache warriors had mounted against the United States Army during the Indian Wars of the 19th century. For over 25 years, a few hundred Apache fighters had held off an army of thousands, using guerrilla tactics, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and marksmanship skills that seemed almost supernatural. What if those skills could be harnessed for the current conflict? The man tasked with creating this program was Colonel Harrison Whitmore, a veteran of the First World War who had spent the interwar years studying unconventional warfare. Whitmore was a controversial figure, brilliant but ruthless, known for his willingness to push ethical boundaries in pursuit of military objectives. He had traveled extensively in the American Southwest, studying Apache culture and interviewing elderly warriors who remembered the old ways. He believed that the Apache possessed genetic and cultural advantages that could be developed into military capabilities far exceeding anything conventional training could produce. In March 1942, Whitmore received authorization to recruit Native American volunteers, specifically targeting members of Apache tribes, for a classified program code named Operation Shadow Walker. The program would select candidates with exceptional marksmanship abilities, subject them to an intensive training regimen that combined modern military techniques with traditional Apache methods, and deploy them as specialized assets in the most difficult combat environments. Recruitment began immediately. Whitmore sent representatives to the San Carlos, Fort Apache, Mescalero, and Jicarilla reservations, offering bonuses and benefits that far exceeded what ordinary soldiers received. The representatives emphasized that this was an opportunity for Apache men to prove their worth, to demonstrate that the warrior tradition was not dead, to earn respect in a society that had treated them as second-class citizens for generations. The response was overwhelming. Over 800 Apache men volunteered for the program. Only 47 were selected. The selection process was brutal. Candidates were subjected to physical and psychological tests that pushed them to the absolute limits of human endurance. They were made to march for days without sleep. They were exposed to extreme temperatures. They were placed in isolation chambers for weeks at a time. They were required to demonstrate not only marksmanship, but also the ability to remain motionless for hours, to control their breathing and heartbeat, to enter states of focused concentration that bordered on the meditative. Those who passed these tests were sent to a secret training facility in the mountains of northern Arizona, a facility that officially did not exist. The training at this facility lasted 18 months. The recruits learned every aspect of the sniper's art, from ballistics and windage calculation to camouflage and concealment techniques. But they also learned something else, something that set them apart from every other sniper program in the world. They learned how to tap into the spiritual traditions of their ancestors. Colonel Whitmore had recruited several Apache elders to serve as advisors to the program. These men, some of whom were in their 80s and 90s, taught the young warriors ceremonies and practices that had been passed down through generations. They taught them how to enter altered states of consciousness that enhanced their perception and focus. They taught them how to communicate with the spirits of dead warriors who could provide guidance and protection. They taught them how to become invisible, not through technology or camouflage, but through a kind of spiritual discipline that made them undetectable to enemy senses. The results were extraordinary. By the time Operation Shadow Walker produced its first graduates in late 1943, the Apache snipers had demonstrated capabilities that seemed to defy explanation. During training exercises, they regularly eliminated targets at distances that conventional snipers considered impossible. They could remain hidden in open terrain that offered no apparent concealment. They could predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy, as if they could see into the future, and most disturbing to the military observers who witnessed their demonstrations, they seemed to be able to kill without leaving any physical evidence of their presence. The first Apache snipers were deployed to the Pacific Theater in January 1944. They were attached to Marine units fighting in the island hopping campaign, assigned to eliminate Japanese officers and specialists whose deaths would disrupt enemy operations. Their performance exceeded every expectation. In their first month of combat, the Apache snipers eliminated over 70 high-value targets, including 3 Japanese generals and a dozen senior staff officers. The impact on enemy morale was devastating. Japanese soldiers began to believe that invisible demons were hunting them through the jungles. Over the next 18 months, Operation Shadow Walker snipers were deployed across the Pacific, from Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. A smaller number were sent to the European theater, where they operated behind German lines in France and Italy. Everywhere they went, they left a trail of dead enemies and terrified survivors. The Germans called them Geisterschützen, ghost shooters. The Japanese called them Kage no Akuma, demons of shadow. Both names reflected the same truth. These were not ordinary soldiers, they were something else entirely. By the time the war ended, the 47 Apache snipers of Operation Shadow Walker had accumulated a combined kill count of over 2,000 confirmed enemy deaths. Individual snipers had tallies ranging from 15 to over 100. They had operated in every major campaign, survived conditions that killed thousands of other soldiers, and completed missions that conventional forces had deemed impossible. They were, by any measure, among the most effective combatants in the entire American military. And then the war ended, and everything changed. The first sign that something was wrong came within weeks of the Japanese surrender. The Apache snipers, who had been scattered across multiple units in the Pacific, were suddenly recalled to the United States. They were told they were being discharged, that their services were no longer required, that they should return to their reservations and resume their civilian lives. But instead of being sent home, They were transported to a military facility in Nevada that none of them had ever heard of. The facility was located in a remote desert valley, surrounded by mountains and accessible only by a single road that was guarded around the clock. The snipers were housed in a barracks that was comfortable but clearly designed for containment. Windows were barred. Doors were locked at night. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. When the snipers asked why they were being held, they were told that processing their discharge papers would take time. When they asked how long, they received no answer. Sergeant First Class William Broken Spear, a Mescalero Apache who had killed 83 confirmed enemy soldiers during the war, was the unofficial leader of the detained snipers. In a journal that was later recovered from his personal effects, Broken Spear documented what happened during those first weeks at the Nevada facility. His entries reveal a growing sense of unease among the men, a feeling that they were not being held for administrative reasons, but for something else entirely. Broken Spear wrote, "They are watching us constantly. Not just the guards, but others, men in civilian clothes who observe us from a distance, who take notes, who whisper among themselves when they think we cannot see. Yesterday, 2 of our brothers were taken away for what they called medical examinations. They returned hours later, pale and shaken, and would not speak about what had been done to them. Something is very wrong here. They did not bring us to this place to send us home. They brought us here because they are afraid of what we might do if they let us go." The medical examinations that Broken Spear mentioned were the first stage of what would become a systematic program of study and exploitation. The military, having witnessed the extraordinary capabilities of the Apache snipers, wanted to understand how those capabilities worked. They wanted to know if the skills could be replicated in non-native soldiers. They wanted to know if the spiritual practices that the snipers had learned could be isolated and weaponized. And they were willing to do almost anything to get those answers. The snipers were subjected to extensive physical and psychological testing. They were given drugs that were supposed to enhance or inhibit various mental functions. They were placed in sensory deprivation chambers for days at a time. They were hooked up to machines that measured their brain waves while they performed the concentration exercises their elders had taught them. Some were subjected to hypnosis. Others were given experimental substances that the documents describe only as Compound 7 and Compound 12. The man in charge of these experiments was a psychiatrist named Dr. Leonard Hartwell, who had previously worked on classified projects related to interrogation and psychological warfare. Hartwell was fascinated by the Apache snipers, particularly by their claims of spiritual communication with dead ancestors. He believed that these experiences, whether real or imagined, held the key to unlocking human capabilities that conventional science had never explored. He also believed that the snipers were potentially dangerous, that their abilities made them a threat to national security if they could not be controlled. In a report dated November 1945, Hartwell wrote, "The subjects demonstrate cognitive and perceptual abilities that exceed normal human parameters by a significant margin. Their capacity for sustained concentration, their sensory acuity, and their emotional regulation surpass anything documented in the scientific literature. Most significantly, several subjects report ongoing communication with spiritual entities that they describe as ancestral guides. While these reports cannot be objectively verified, the subject's performance suggests that some form of enhanced intuition or perception is genuinely occurring. The question is whether these abilities can be transferred to other individuals, or whether they are unique to these subjects' genetic and cultural background. The experiments continued for 6 months. During that time, 3 of the 47 Apache snipers died under circumstances that the official records describe as medical complications. Broken Spear's journal tells a different story. He wrote that one man, Private Daniel Crow Feather, died after being given an overdose of an experimental drug. Another, Corporal James Running Deer, hanged himself in his cell after weeks of solitary confinement. A third, Private First Class Thomas White Mountain, simply stopped eating and willed himself to death in a traditional Apache way of ending one's life when continuation became impossible. Broken Spear wrote, "They are killing us slowly, not with bullets, but with needles and questions and the endless watching. Every day they take more from us. They want to know our secrets. They want to steal the knowledge that our grandfathers gave us. But they do not understand that this knowledge cannot be stolen. It can only be given, and we will never give it to them. We will die first, all of us, every one." In March 1946, something changed. The experiments abruptly ended. The surviving snipers were told they would finally be discharged. But there was a condition. They were required to sign documents pledging never to discuss their wartime service, the training they had received, or the experiments that had been conducted on them. They were told that any violation of this pledge would result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act. They were told that their families would be watched, that any suspicious activity would be reported, that the government would never stop monitoring them. Most of the snipers signed. They wanted to go home. They wanted to see their families. They wanted to forget what had been done to them and try to rebuild their lives. But a handful refused. These men, led by Broken Spear, demanded answers. They demanded to know why they had been held. They demanded accountability for the deaths of their brothers. They demanded to be treated as the heroes they had been told they were, not as prisoners and experimental subjects. The military's response was swift and ruthless. The snipers who refused to sign were transferred to a psychiatric facility in Maryland, where they were diagnosed with various mental disorders and committed indefinitely. Their families were told they had suffered breakdowns, that they were receiving the best possible care, that visits would not be possible for the foreseeable future. In effect, they were disappeared. Broken Spear spent 11 years in that facility. His journal, which he somehow managed to continue writing despite the restrictions placed on him, documents his gradual deterioration. He was given electroshock treatments. He was drugged into stupors that lasted for weeks. He was placed in isolation whenever he became difficult. By the time he was finally released in 1957, he was a broken man, barely recognizable as the fearsome warrior who had terrorized Japanese generals across the Pacific. He returned to Mescalero and lived in a small cabin on the edge of the reservation. He rarely spoke to anyone. He refused to participate in tribal ceremonies or community events. He sat on his porch and stared at the mountains, lost in memories that no one else could share. He died in 1963, alone and forgotten, his body not discovered for 3 days. But Broken Spear's journal survived. He had hidden it beneath the floorboards of his cabin, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and decay. It was not discovered until 1991. When the cabin was demolished to make way for new construction. A worker found the bundle and, curious about its contents, took it home rather than discarding it. He showed it to his grandfather, an elderly Apache man who recognized Broken Spear's name and understood immediately what he was looking at. The journal eventually made its way to the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, where it was catalogued and stored in the archives. For years, it sat unread, just another document in a collection of millions. Then, in 2006, a researcher named Dr. Patricia Morningstar, herself a descendant of San Carlos Apache, came across a reference to the journal while researching Native American military service. What she found in those pages would consume the next decade of her life. The journal contained not only Broken Spear's personal account, but also information about other members of Operation Shadow Walker. He had kept track of his brothers as best he could, recording what he knew of their fates. Some had returned to their reservations and tried to live normal lives. Others had drifted into alcoholism and homelessness. Several had committed suicide, A few had simply vanished, their whereabouts unknown to family or friends. But the most disturbing entries concerned a group of snipers who had been approached by government representatives in the years after the war. These men, approximately a dozen in number, had been offered employment in what Broken Spear described as continuing operations. They had been told that their skills were still needed, that there were enemies who required elimination, that they could serve their country in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. Some of them had accepted. Broken Spear wrote, "I do not know where they went or what they did. I only know that they stopped writing letters. They stopped visiting home. Their families received money every month, always in cash, always without explanation. And sometimes, years later, we would hear that one of them had died. Heart attack, car accident, hunting accident. Always an accident, never a funeral, never a body to bury. They were ghosts even before they stopped breathing." Dr. Morningstar spent years tracking down the descendants of Operation Shadow Walker snipers, searching for any additional information about what had happened to them. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to the program. She interviewed elderly Apache who remembered the men. She traveled to archives across the country, searching for clues in military records, medical files, and government correspondence. What she found was a pattern of systematic erasure. The official records of Operation Shadow Walker had been destroyed in 1973, supposedly as part of a routine document purge. The personnel files of the snipers had been sealed and then lost. The training facility in Arizona had been demolished in 1952. The land returned to the Navajo Nation with no explanation of what had been built there. It was as if the entire program had never existed, but traces remained. In the personal papers of Colonel Harrison Whitmore, which had been donated to a military history archive after his death in 1968, Morningstar found references to a successor program called Project Nightfall. This program, according to Whitmore's notes, had recruited veterans of Operation Shadow Walker for covert operations during the Cold War. The notes did not specify what these operations involved, but they mentioned deployments to Korea, Vietnam, and several locations in Central and South America. Morningstar also found a letter that Whitmore had written to a colleague in 1961, discussing the legacy of the Apache sniper program. In the letter, Whitmore expressed both pride and regret. He wrote, "We created something extraordinary with those men, capabilities that exceeded anything I thought possible. But we also created something dangerous. They were never fully under our control. They followed orders when it suited them, but their true loyalty was always to something older and deeper than the United States government. In the end, I wonder if we were wise to awaken what we awakened. Some powers, once summoned, cannot be easily dismissed." The letter ended with a cryptic observation that Morningstar has never been able to fully explain. Whitmore wrote, "The eldest among them warned me at the very beginning that what we were doing would have consequences. He said that the spirits we were asking them to invoke were not servants to be commanded, but forces to be respected. He said that if we used their gifts for evil purposes, those spirits would remember. They would wait, and eventually they would demand payment. I dismissed his warnings as superstition. Now, in my old age, I'm not so sure." What did Whitmore mean by payment? What consequences was he anticipating? And what happened to the Apache snipers who joined Project Nightfall? These questions led Dr. Morningstar deeper into a labyrinth of classified programs, covert operations, and unexplained deaths that spans decades and touches some of the darkest moments in American history. The story she eventually pieced together is one of the most disturbing accounts of government exploitation of indigenous peoples ever documented. It is a story of men who gave everything for their country, only to be used, discarded, and forgotten. It is a story of spiritual traditions weaponized for purposes that violated everything they were meant to protect. And it is a story that has never been officially acknowledged, never been investigated, never been addressed by the institutions responsible for what happened. But perhaps most disturbing of all, it is a story that may not be over. Because among the documents that Morningstar obtained through her research was a memorandum dated 2004, discussing the possibility of reviving certain aspects of the original Apache sniper program. The memorandum, heavily redacted but still partially legible, references ongoing research into enhanced human performance and the potential value of traditional indigenous knowledge in developing new operational capabilities. The program that destroyed William Broken Spear and so many others may still be active. The lessons learned from their suffering may still be applied. The spirits that Colonel Whitmore warned about may still be waiting for their payment. And somewhere, in archives that remain classified, in facilities that officially do not exist, the full truth about what happened to the Apache snipers after World War II remains hidden, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be revealed, waiting for someone brave enough to demand answers that powerful people do not want to give. The question is whether that someone will ever emerge. The question is whether the truth will ever be fully known. The question is whether the descendants of those warriors will ever receive the justice they deserve. And beneath all these questions lies another, darker question that William Broken Spear posed in the final entry of his journal, written just weeks before his death in 1963. He wrote, "They wanted our power. They wanted to steal what our ancestors gave us. But power cannot be stolen without consequences. The spirits see everything, they remember everything, and they are patient, so patient. I will not live to see the payment come due, but it will come. For everyone who used us, for everyone who experimented on us, for everyone who threw us away when we were no longer useful. The spirits will collect what is owed. And then, finally, we will have peace." 60 years later, that payment has still not come. Or has it? What happens in the shadows, in the classified programs, in the secret facilities? What debts are being collected that we know nothing about? What forces, awakened during World War II and never properly dismissed, continue to move through the world, seeking balance, seeking justice, seeking the reckoning that was promised so long ago? These are questions without easy answers, but they are questions that deserve to be asked. They are questions that demand to be asked, because the Apache snipers who served their country with such extraordinary courage and skill deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to be honored, not as victims, but as warriors whose legacy continues to shape the world in ways we are only beginning to understand. Remember their names. Remember their sacrifice. Remember what was done to them. And never stop asking what happened to the Apache snipers after World War II. The truth is out there, buried in archives and hidden in classified files. Someday, someone will find it. Someday, the full story will be known. Someday, justice will come. Until then, the spirits are watching, the spirits are waiting, and they never forget. Dr. Patricia Morningstar published her findings in 2014 in a book titled The Shadow Walkers, America's Forgotten Apache Warriors. The book documented everything she had discovered over nearly a decade of research. From the creation of Operation Shadow Walker to the experiments conducted on the snipers after the war, from Project Nightfall to the systematic erasure of the entire program from official history. It was a damning indictment of how the United States government had treated some of its most effective and loyal soldiers. The response to the book was immediate and polarized. Within Native American communities, it became a rallying point for discussions about the exploitation of indigenous peoples by the military. Veterans groups demanded investigations. Tribal councils passed resolutions calling for official acknowledgement and compensation. For a brief moment, it seemed like the truth about the Apache snipers might finally receive the attention it deserved. But then, something strange happened. The book began to disappear, not metaphorically, literally. Copies that had been purchased from online retailers were reported as lost in shipping. Libraries that had ordered the book found their orders cancelled without explanation. The publisher, a small academic press in New Mexico, received a visit from representatives of an unnamed government agency who requested a meeting with the owners. Within 6 months of that meeting, the publisher announced that they were ceasing all further printings of the Shadow Walkers due to undisclosed legal concerns. Dr. Morningstar herself experienced a series of unsettling incidents. Her office at the University of Arizona was broken into, though nothing of obvious value was taken. Her computer was hacked, and files related to her research were corrupted or deleted. She received anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, calls where no one spoke, but she could hear breathing on the other end. Her car was vandalized twice, and in January 2015, she was denied tenure despite having published more than any other candidate in her department. She did not give up. She moved her research to a secure location, made multiple backup copies of all her documents, and continued her investigation through unofficial channels. She connected with other researchers who had encountered similar resistance when investigating classified military programs. She built a network of sources within the intelligence community who were willing to share information anonymously, and she began to uncover layers of the story that even she had not anticipated. The first major breakthrough came in 2016, when a retired CIA officer contacted her through an encrypted messaging service. The officer, who identified himself only as Raven, claimed to have worked on projects related to Operation Shadow Walker during the 1970s. He said he had information that would change everything she thought she knew about what happened to the Apache snipers. Raven told Morningstar that Project Nightfall had been only one of several successor programs that recruited veterans of Operation Shadow Walker. Another program, which he called Project Wendigo, had focused specifically on the spiritual aspects of the Apache snipers' abilities. This program had attempted to isolate and replicate the techniques that the snipers used to enhance their perception, their intuition, and their apparent ability to become invisible to enemies. The experiments conducted under Project Wendigo made the earlier work of Dr. Hartwell look benign by comparison. Subjects were given massive doses of psychedelic substances while being exposed to recordings of Apache ceremonial chants. They were placed in sensory deprivation tanks for weeks at a time, emerging with permanent psychological damage. They were subjected to techniques that Raven described only as invasive neural procedures, which left some of them unable to speak or care for themselves. Most of the subjects of Project Wendigo were not Apache. They were soldiers from other backgrounds who had volunteered for what they were told was an experimental program to enhance combat effectiveness. But a handful of Apache veterans from Operation Shadow Walker were involved, either as subjects or as advisors. These men, according to Raven, were treated differently from the other subjects. They were considered too valuable to risk with the most dangerous experiments. Instead, they were used as templates, studied and analyzed and measured in every conceivable way, so that researchers could try to understand how their abilities worked. One of these men was Corporal Samuel Firecloud, a White Mountain Apache who had served as a sniper in the Pacific Theater during the war. Firecloud had been one of the most skilled marksmen in Operation Shadow Walker, with over 90 confirmed kills to his name. After the war, he had refused to sign the secrecy documents and had been committed to the same psychiatric facility as William Broken Spear. But unlike Broken Spear, Firecloud had not been released in the 1950s. He had remained in custody, transferred from facility to facility for over 3 decades. Raven provided Morningstar with documents showing that Firecloud had been kept alive specifically for his value to Project Wendigo and its successors. He had been studied continuously, his brain scanned, his blood analyzed, his psychological responses measured and recorded. Researchers had attempted to use him as a conduit to the spiritual entities that he claimed to communicate with, trying to establish contact with the ancestral forces that the Apache believed protected their warriors. These attempts had not gone well. According to the documents Raven provided, several researchers who worked closely with Firecloud experienced severe psychological disturbances. One suffered a complete mental breakdown after a session in which he claimed to have seen something emerge from Firecloud's body, something that spoke to him in a language he did not understand. Another committed suicide, leaving a note that said only, "They are coming for all of us." A third simply disappeared, walking out of the facility one night and never being seen again. Firecloud himself remained apparently unaffected by the experiments. He cooperated when required, answered questions when asked, and submitted to whatever tests the researchers demanded. But according to the facility staff who observed him, he never seemed truly present. He spent hours staring at walls, his lips moving silently, as if he were having conversations with entities that no one else could see. When asked who he was talking to, he would only smile and say, "My grandfathers. They are always with me. They will never leave." In 1983, Firecloud died in custody. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the documents Raven provided included an autopsy report that told a different story. The report noted numerous anomalies in Firecloud's body that the pathologist could not explain. His brain showed patterns of neural development that had never been documented in any other human subject. His blood contained compounds that could not be identified. And most disturbing of all, his heart showed no signs of disease or damage. It had simply stopped beating, as if someone had turned off a switch. The pathologist's conclusion, buried in a classified addendum that was never included in the official file, stated, "Subject's death appears to have been voluntary." All physiological indicators suggest that cardiac arrest was initiated by the subject himself, through means that are not currently understood by medical science. It is the opinion of this examiner that the subject chose to die, and that he possessed the ability to end his own life through willpower alone. Firecloud had escaped the only way he could. After 38 years in captivity, after countless experiments and interrogations and indignities, he had simply decided that it was time to leave, and nothing the government could do had been able to stop him. But the story of Samuel Firecloud does not end with his death, because according to Raven, something happened in the months after Firecloud passed away, something that terrified the researchers who had studied him for so long. Staff at the facility began reporting strange occurrences. Objects moved on their own. Lights flickered without explanation. Temperature drops occurred in rooms that had no apparent cause. And several staff members reported seeing a figure in the hallways at night, a figure that resembled Firecloud, walking silently through locked doors and passing through solid walls. At first, the administrators dismissed these reports as the result of stress and overactive imaginations. But as the incidents continued and multiplied, they were forced to take them seriously. Security cameras captured images that could not be explained, shadows moving in ways that defied physics, shapes that appeared and disappeared without warning. Audio recordings picked up sounds that analysis confirmed were human voices speaking in the Apache language, even though no one in the facility spoke Apache. The facility was evacuated in April 1984. The official reason given was structural concerns, but the internal documents told a different story. The evacuation order, signed by a senior official whose name was redacted, stated, Continued operations at this location are no longer viable due to ongoing phenomena that cannot be controlled or contained. All research materials are to be transferred to alternate sites. Personnel are to be debriefed and monitored for signs of psychological contamination. This facility is to be demolished and the land remediated to eliminate any residual influence. The facility was demolished 6 months later. The land where it stood is now a federal wildlife preserve, closed to the public without explanation. Rangers who patrol the area report that animals avoid certain spots, that their equipment sometimes malfunctions for no apparent reason, that they occasionally hear sounds in the distance that seem to be human voices chanting in an unfamiliar language. Raven told Morningstar that Firecloud's case was not unique. Other Apache veterans of Operation Shadow Walker who died in custody had left similar legacies. Their spirits, it seemed, did not accept death as an ending. They remained attached to the places where they had suffered, and they made their presence known in ways that defied scientific explanation. The government's response to these phenomena was characteristically bureaucratic. A classified program was established to study what the documents call residual psychic imprints left by deceased subjects with enhanced capabilities. This program, which operated under various code names over the decades, attempted to understand and eventually control the spiritual forces that the Apache snipers had apparently unleashed. It failed completely. Every attempt to contain or direct these forces resulted in disaster. Researchers who approached the work with skepticism found themselves experiencing inexplicable psychological symptoms. Those who approached it with respect found themselves drawn into practices and beliefs that the military considered dangerous and uncontrollable. Equipment designed to measure spiritual phenomena produced readings that made no sense. Facilities built to contain residual influences became unusable within months. The program was officially terminated in 2002, though Raven believed that certain aspects continued under deep cover. The official conclusion, buried in a classified report that has never been released, stated, "The phenomena associated with deceased subjects from Operation Shadow Walker and related programs do not respond to conventional containment or exploitation methodologies. These phenomena appear to operate according to principles that are not accessible to current scientific understanding. Further research is not recommended, as all previous attempts have resulted in unacceptable costs in personnel and resources. It is the recommendation of this committee that all materials related to these phenomena be archived and that no further investigation be undertaken." In other words, the government gave up. After decades of trying to steal, replicate and control the spiritual powers of the Apache warriors, they finally admitted that they could not. The ancestors had won, but the story does not end there. Because Dr. Morningstar's research uncovered one more thread, one more layer of the mystery that she has spent years trying to unravel. It concerns the Apache snipers, who were never captured, never experimented upon, never held in secret facilities. It concerns the ones who simply disappeared. According to Broken Spear's journal and other sources Morningstar located, approximately a dozen Operation Shadow Walker veterans vanished in the years after the war. They did not return to their reservations. They did not maintain contact with family or friends. They did not appear in any government records after their discharge. They simply ceased to exist, as if they had walked into the wilderness and never come back. For years, the assumption was that these men had died, either by suicide or misadventure, their bodies never recovered. But Raven suggested a different possibility. He told Morningstar that intelligence reports from the 1950s and 60s occasionally mentioned sightings of individuals matching the descriptions of the missing snipers. These sightings occurred in remote areas across the American Southwest, in the mountains and deserts where the Apache had lived for centuries before the arrival of Europeans. The reports described men who appeared and disappeared without warning, who were seen briefly by hunters or hikers or forest rangers, who seemed to emerge from the landscape itself and then vanish back into it. They were never caught on camera. They left no physical traces. They were like ghosts, or perhaps more accurately, like spirits who had not fully departed the world of the living. Raven believed that these missing snipers had made a choice. Rather than submit to the government's experiments or try to reintegrate into a society that had no place for them, they had returned to the old ways completely. They had gone back to the mountains where their ancestors had lived and fought and died. They had abandoned the modern world and all its complications. They had become what their grandfathers had been, warriors of the wilderness, guardians of sacred places, spirits walking in human form. If this is true, if some of the Apache snipers of Operation Shadow Walker are still out there, they would be very old now. The youngest veterans of the program would be in their 90s. But the Apache traditions speak of warriors who transcended the normal limitations of human lifespan, who were sustained by their connection to the spiritual world, who remained in the land long after their bodies should have failed. Perhaps these traditions are more than just stories. Perhaps some of those warriors are still walking, still watching, still protecting places that no outsider should ever find. Dr. Morningstar has spent years searching for evidence of these surviving snipers. She has traveled to some of the most remote areas of Arizona and New Mexico, following leads and rumors and whispered stories from elderly Apache, who claim to have seen things in the mountains that they cannot explain. She has never found definitive proof, but she has found something else. She has found communities that still remember, that still honor the old ways, that still believe in the power of the ancestors to protect their descendants. In 2019, Morningstar visited a small settlement on the edge of the Gila Wilderness in New Mexico. The settlement was not on any official map. Its residents were Apache who had chosen to live apart from the reservation system, maintaining traditional practices that had been suppressed elsewhere. The elders of this community agreed to speak with Morningstar, but only after she underwent a purification ceremony that lasted 3 days. What they told her has never been published. Morningstar has said only that the conversation changed her understanding of everything she thought she knew about the Apache snipers and their fate. She has said that the elders shared knowledge with her that she is not permitted to reveal. Knowledge that confirmed some of her suspicions while raising new questions that she may never be able to answer. She has also said that during her time in the settlement, she saw something. She will not describe what she saw in detail. She will only say that she now understands why the Apache snipers were so effective, why the government was so desperate to understand their abilities, and why all attempts to replicate or control those abilities ultimately failed. The power that protected those warriors, she has written, is not something that can be understood through Western scientific methods. It is not something that can be stolen or bought or forced to serve purposes for which it was not intended. It is a living relationship between the warriors and their ancestors, a covenant that extends across generations, a bond that death itself cannot break. Those who try to exploit this power without understanding its nature will inevitably fail, and those who try to harm the people it protects will eventually face consequences they cannot escape. This brings us back to the warning that William Broken Spear wrote in the final entry of his journal. The spirits will collect what is owed. Over 60 years have passed since Broken Spear died alone in his cabin in Mescalero. What has happened in those 6 decades? What debts have been collected? What payments have been made? Dr. Morningstar has documented a disturbing pattern that may provide some answers. She has tracked the fates of individuals who were directly involved in the exploitation of the Apache snipers, from Colonel Whitmore to Dr. Hartwell, to the administrators and researchers who ran the various classified programs. The pattern she has found is consistent and chilling. Harrison Whitmore, the architect of Operation Shadow Walker, suffered a complete mental breakdown in 1965. He spent the last 3 years of his life in a private psychiatric facility, plagued by visions that he described as warriors emerging from the walls to accuse him of betrayal. He died in 1968, reportedly screaming in an unknown language. Leonard Hartwell, the psychiatrist who conducted the first experiments on the captured snipers, developed a degenerative neurological condition that no doctor could diagnose. He lost the ability to speak coherently, then the ability to walk, then the ability to recognize his own family. He died in 1974, having spent his final years in a state that his physicians described as conscious but unreachable, as if his mind had become trapped somewhere that medical science could not follow. Of the 37 researchers who worked directly with Apache subjects during Project Wendigo, 23 died before reaching the age of 60. The causes of death varied, from cancer to heart disease to accidents to suicide. But the statistical probability of this mortality rate occurring by chance is less than 1 in 10,000. Something was killing these people. Something was ensuring that those who had exploited the Apache warriors did not enjoy long or peaceful lives. Even more disturbing are the cases that Morningstar has documented among the descendants of these researchers. Several children and grandchildren of Project Wendigo personnel have experienced psychological disturbances that echo the symptoms reported by their parents and grandparents. They have nightmares about places they have never been. They hear voices speaking languages they do not know. They feel watched, followed, hunted by presences they cannot identify. One woman, the granddaughter of a Project Wendigo administrator, contacted Morningstar in 2020 to share her experiences. She said that she had been haunted by dreams of Apache warriors since childhood. She said that these dreams had intensified as she grew older, becoming more vivid and more frightening. She said that she had recently begun seeing figures in her peripheral vision, shapes that disappeared when she turned to look at them directly. And she said that she had begun to hear her grandfather's voice, even though he had been dead for 30 years, apologizing for things she did not understand. This woman asked Morningstar what she should do. Morningstar told her the only thing she could think of. She told her to find an Apache elder and ask for help. She told her that the spirits who were haunting her might be persuaded to leave, but only if approached with respect and humility. She told her that the sins of the grandfather could perhaps be atoned for by the granddaughter, if the granddaughter was willing to acknowledge the wrong that had been done and ask for forgiveness. The woman followed this advice. She traveled to the Mescalero reservation and sought out an elder who was willing to speak with her. What happened during that conversation and during the ceremony that followed, she has never disclosed. But she has told Morningstar that the dreams have stopped. The figures no longer appear in her peripheral vision, and her grandfather's voice has fallen silent. Perhaps this is the answer. Perhaps the payment that Broken Spear predicted does not have to be extracted in suffering and death. Perhaps it can be made through acknowledgement, through apology, through the simple act of admitting that a wrong was done and asking for the chance to make it right. But for this to happen, the truth must be known. The story of the Apache snipers must be told, the sacrifices they made, the exploitation they endured, the courage they demonstrated in the face of unimaginable treatment. All of this must be brought into the light where it can no longer be denied or ignored. This is why Dr. Morningstar continues her work, despite the obstacles and the dangers. This is why she has spent over a decade documenting what happened to these men, tracking down every lead, fighting for every scrap of information. This is why she has refused to be silenced, even when powerful forces have tried to bury her research and destroy her career. The Apache snipers of Operation Shadow Walker were among the greatest warriors America has ever produced. They served their country with distinction and honor, accomplishing feats that seemed impossible. defeating enemies who outnumbered and outgunned them. They deserved to come home as heroes. Instead, they came home as prisoners, as experimental subjects, as inconvenient reminders of powers that the modern world prefers not to acknowledge. Their story deserves to be remembered. Their sacrifice deserves to be honored, and the wrong that was done to them deserves to be acknowledged, even if that acknowledgement comes decades too late. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. In their infinite mercy, you will find the strength to face the uncomfortable truths of history. In their wisdom, you will find the courage to acknowledge the sins of the past and seek reconciliation with those who were harmed. The same divine love that sustained the Apache warriors through their suffering can sustain you through whatever trials you face. The same faith that allowed them to maintain their connection to their ancestors can connect you to a power greater than yourself. But faith must be accompanied by action. If you are moved by this story, do something about it. Learn more about the Native American veterans who served this country and were betrayed by it. Support organizations that advocate for indigenous peoples and their rights. Speak out against the exploitation and erasure of Native American history. And if you are a descendant of those who participated in these programs, consider following the example of the woman who sought forgiveness. The spirits may be waiting for you to take the first step. The Apache snipers are watching. From the mountains where some of them may still walk, from the spirit world where others have joined their ancestors, from the collective memory of a people who have never forgotten what was done to them, they are watching. They are waiting to see what we will do with the truth now that it has been revealed. Will we acknowledge their sacrifice? Will we honor their memory? Will we seek the forgiveness that might finally allow their spirits to rest? Or will we continue to bury the truth, to pretend that these things never happened, to allow the exploitation of indigenous peoples to remain hidden in classified files and forgotten archives? The choice is ours. The payment is ours to make. And the ancestors are watching to see if we will make it. In the silence of the desert night, in the whisper of wind through the pines, in the echo of footsteps on mountain trails that no living person walks, they are waiting, patient as they have always been, eternal as the land itself. They have not forgotten what was done to them. They will never forget, and neither should you. Remember the Apache snipers. Remember Operation Shadow Walker. Remember the men who gave everything for their country and received only betrayal in return. Their story is now part of you. Their truth is now your responsibility. What will you do with it? The ancestors are watching, and they are counting on you.